Good evening, my friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, take a slow breath and let your shoulders settle. Maybe the lamp beside you is already dimmed, or perhaps you hear the low hum of a fan or the rustle of a night breeze through a cracked window. Wherever you are, this is a moment meant for calm, for memory, for drifting with gentle stories. Tonight, we'll wander back to the 1940s, to a war most of us know only through pictures and newsreels. Yet not every battle was fought with rifles or tanks. Some of the most vital work was done by young men behind the wheels of trucks, carrying fuel, food, and hope across dangerous roads. It was called the Red Ball Express, and it kept whole armies alive. If you find comfort in these stories, I invite you, quietly, without urgency, to follow along, to like or subscribe, or even to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time of night it is. I always smile when I see how these gentle tales travel the world as you drift to sleep. Now close your eyes if you like, and imagine a small tent in the gray hours before dawn. A boy, only 19, wakes to a whistle in the dark. His secret wish is simple: to be home again, in his mother's kitchen. That is where our story begins. A soldier's secret wish lingers quietly in the dawn. The canvas of the tent shivers faintly with the first strokes of wind. A whistle cuts through the quiet, high and sharp, and inside, a young man's eyes snap open. His name is James Wilson, 19 years old, Cleveland born, and in this gray hour, he is not thinking of glory or medals. He is thinking of the smell of fried eggs in his mother's kitchen, of soft sheets and warm mornings, and of a life that has slipped suddenly into memory. He pulls the rough wool blanket up to his chin, but it scratches instead of soothes. The air is damp, heavy with the smell of diesel fuel and wet canvas. His boots, waiting on the floor, already glisten with a shallow pool of rainwater. The cot creaks when he sits up. He feels every ounce of mud beneath him, as if the earth itself is tugging at his legs, reminding him this is not home. And yet, inside, there is a wish, a stubborn, hidden longing, not shouted, not even whispered, but carried like a small flame in the pocket of his heart. He longs to survive, to go back, to walk again along the familiar sidewalks of his old neighborhood. He pictures the gas station where he worked just months ago, the greasy smell of engines, the rhythm of life before the draft notice appeared. He wonders if the streets still look the same. Outside, voices bark commands. "On your feet, Wilson!" It is Sergeant Harris, stocky and unbending, the man who will become both burden and anchor in these months ahead. James swings his legs over the side, and his boots land with a splash. Cold water seeps through the worn leather. He sighs, but does not complain. Complaints have no place here. He shoulders his jacket, stiff, with dampness, and steps outside into the drizzle. The camp is stirring like a restless animal. Drivers shuffling toward the mess tent, mechanics already bent over engines, smoke curling up from hurried fires. A crow calls somewhere beyond the hedges, its voice harsh against the soft patter of rain. James thinks again of Cleveland, of mornings when the loudest sound was the streetcar bell 2 blocks over. He misses that. He misses the ordinariness. War is anything but ordinary, and still, it is filled with strange, ordinary tasks: lacing boots, polishing helmets, queuing for powdered eggs. Perhaps that is why the secret wish burns so strongly, because the mind, weary of mud and orders, longs for the rhythm of what once was. He takes his tray in the mess tent. The eggs wobble, rubbery and pale. The coffee, black as tar, smells bitter but comforting. Davis, the man who will soon become his closest companion, sits nearby, eyes half shut with fatigue. He nudges James and murmurs, "Another day, another road." The words are heavy, yet there is a spark of humor. James forces a small smile. As he eats, the wish returns, uninvited. He pictures the red brick of his mother's house, the flower pots by the window, the radio humming soft dance tunes. He thinks of sitting at the kitchen table, letters spread before him, no urgency but to choose the right words. Here, in the Army's world of mud and diesel, such images are both painful and soothing. Painful because they are out of reach, soothing because they remind him that another life exists, waiting. The sergeant calls the men out again. "Convoy prep." "Check your trucks." Every inch James sets down his cup, still half full. He follows the others, the drizzle turning to steady rain. Rows of trucks stand ready, olive drab paint shining wet. Engines cough and rumble as drivers climb aboard. These machines are both cage and companion, their growls familiar as voices in the night. James places a hand on the fender of the truck that will soon be his. Cold metal, slick with rain. He doesn't yet know it will carry him through ambushes, broken bridges, endless miles of fatigue. Right now, he only knows it is heavy, demanding, and alive with a kind of stubborn will. His hidden wish remains, tucked away like a letter in his chest. Each morning it wakes with him, quiet but insistent, reminding him why he endures, not for medals, not for glory, but for the hope of returning one day to the quiet kitchen of home. Morning chores echo home life in muddy fields abroad. The day was not yet awake, yet every man in camp moved as if the sun already pressed down on their shoulders. Morning in the Army had no respect for dawn or darkness. It simply arrived when the whistle blew, and men obeyed. James Wilson stepped from the damp canvas flap of his tent into the half-light of a Norman spring morning, where the rain still lingered in the air like a memory that refused to leave. The ground sucked at his boots, thick with mud from last night's storm. A thin fog lay over the hedgerows and fields beyond, making the world seem smaller, closer, like he was walking in a dream. All around him, silhouettes of soldiers moved with the slow efficiency of routine. Jackets pulled tight, helmets balanced on heads that nodded with fatigue. He fell into step with them, his breath clouding faintly in the cool air. The mess tent loomed ahead, a sagging canvas structure whose seams dripped steadily from the rain. Smoke from cooking fires curled out of its open flap, mixing with the sharper scent of diesel that always seemed to cling to camp. James joined the line of men waiting with metal trays clutched to their chests. The line shuffled forward in silence, broken only by the slop of mud underfoot and the occasional cough. When his turn came, a weary cook with a ladle the size of a shovel plopped a mound of powdered eggs onto his tray. The eggs quivered, rubbery and pale yellow, like something remembered imperfectly. A slice of toast, hard at the edges, followed, and then a cup of coffee so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. James carried his tray to the nearest bench, where Davis was already sitting, hunched over his own meal. "Morning, Wilson," Davis muttered, his eyes still half closed. He stirred his coffee with a bent spoon and sniffed it cautiously, as though it might bite. James set his tray down. "If this is morning, I'd hate to see what evening looks like." His voice was soft, without complaint, but the words carried the fatigue of endless repetition. The men ate quickly, their conversation muted. The air was thick with the smells of damp wool, burnt coffee, and muddy boots drying near the stove. For James, the moment felt both ordinary and strange. Ordinary, because every morning began this way: eggs, coffee, the shuffle of tired men. Strange, because the setting was foreign. A tent on foreign soil, surrounded by hedges older than his entire country, waiting for orders that could carry them to beaches where history itself would change. As he chewed, he thought of mornings back in Cleveland, his mother frying bacon, the crackle of grease in a pan, the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery drifting in through the kitchen window. The memory wrapped around him like a shawl, gentle and bittersweet. He swallowed hard, letting the taste of powdered eggs dissolve into the memory of food that once carried love. The sergeant's voice broke the fragile moment. "Move it, men. Trucks don't wait." Harris's bark carried across the tent like a hammer striking iron. Trays clattered as soldiers hurried to finish. James gulped his coffee, wincing at its bitterness, and followed the others outside. The motor pool stretched before them, a field of olive-drab giants lined in neat rows. The trucks stood waiting, hoods beaded with rain, white stars painted proudly on their doors. They looked less like machines than silent beasts ready to be harnessed. Mechanics crawled over them like caretakers, checking oil, tightening bolts, wiping down windshields. The steady cough and growl of idling engines filled the damp air, a chorus both reassuring and ominous. James walked among them, boots slipping slightly in the mud, until he reached truck number 4077, the one assigned to him. Its cab was open to the drizzle, its canvas roof sagging with water. He placed a hand on the steering wheel, cold and slick, and felt the vibration of the idling engine through the steel. It was not his yet, not truly, but soon it would become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The sergeant paced before the line of drivers. His voice was loud but steady, a metronome to their movements. "These trucks are your lifeline. You will treat them better than yourselves. Know their sounds, know their quirks, know when they breathe wrong. Because when you roll out, gentlemen, these machines are all that stand between victory and collapse." James listened, eyes on the ground, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet. He did not need Harris to tell him how important the trucks were. He could see it in the mountain of crates stacked nearby, ammunition, fuel, rations, bandages. Without them, the soldiers on the front lines would starve, stall, and bleed without relief. Without the trucks, the war would grind to a halt. Davis appeared at his side, tightening his jacket against the drizzle. "Looks like we've been married off," he said, nodding at the rows of trucks. "Only difference is, this bride weighs 5 tons and snores louder than a train." James chuckled softly, the sound surprising even himself. "And no chance of a honeymoon." The rain thickened, drumming steadily on canvas and metal. Mechanics shouted for spare parts. Engines roared to life one after another, filling the morning with a deep vibration that settled into the bones. The men moved among the machines, checking tires, tightening straps, running hands over cold steel as though memorizing each line and curve. James climbed into the cab of his truck, the seat hard and unyielding beneath him. The smell of oil and grease filled his nose, strangely comforting. He turned the key, pressed the starter, and felt the engine shudder awake. The growl was uneven at first, then steadied into a low rumble. He gripped the wheel, wide and heavy, and imagined the endless miles it would demand from him. As he sat there, rain streaking the windshield, the secret wish stirred again. He pictured himself driving not through muddy French roads, but down familiar Cleveland streets, past the gas station where he once worked, past neighbors waving from porches, past the bakery with its sweet, yeasty air. The thought made the morning feel lighter, if only for a heartbeat. The whistle blew again. Engines revved louder. Harris raised his hand, and the drivers snapped to attention. The day had begun in earnest. There would be no softening of its pace. The morning muster was complete. Now the real work waited. A truck becomes more than steel on weary roads. The rain had eased by mid-morning, leaving the sky pale and streaked with thin clouds. Puddles gleamed across the motor pool like small mirrors, broken only by the boots of men hurrying between trucks. Somewhere in the distance, gulls wheeled overhead, their cries oddly out of place among the cough of engines and the clank of tools. James Wilson stood beside his truck now, though he was still learning to believe it. Number 4077, a GMC CCKW, loomed above him. Its paint, olive drab and still fresh, glistened wet. The broad white star painted on its door seemed to glow faintly in the weak light. He reached out, fingers brushing the fender. Cold, solid, alive, in a way that only machines at rest can seem. Waiting, almost breathing. The sergeant had said these trucks were their lifeblood, their best friends, their wives. James thought that was a strange way to speak of steel and grease, but standing there, hand pressed to the fender, he began to understand. This truck would carry him into places where roads barely existed, across bridges that might collapse beneath its weight, through nights so dark that the only guidance would be two faint red slits of light ahead. If he was to survive, he would have to know this machine as well as he knew the sound of his own heartbeat. He circled slowly, boots sinking into the mud. The truck was massive, longer than 2 cars nose to tail. Its 6 wheels, caked already in dirt from test runs, looked sturdy as boulders. Beneath the hood, a 270 cubic inch engine growled when he started it, the vibration running through the steel like a deep sigh. 104 horsepower, numbers he repeated in his head, though they meant little compared to the reality of its strength. James climbed into the cab. The seat was hard, unforgiving. The steering wheel spread wide before him, larger than any he had ever handled. His uncle's pickup back in Cleveland had felt like a toy compared to this. He placed both hands on the wheel, thumbs braced, and exhaled. The engine's steady thrum filled his chest. Davis slid into the passenger seat with an easy grin, rifle balanced against his knee. "Well, partner, she's not much to look at, but she's ours." James smiled faintly. "Feels like she could eat the road for breakfast." The sergeant barked more orders outside, his voice cutting through the engine noise. Mechanics waved wrenches in the air, finishing last checks. Trucks rumbled awake one by one, their exhaust rising in ghostly clouds that drifted across the field. The motor pool came alive, a herd of iron beasts restless to be set free. James tested the pedals. The clutch was stiff, resisting his foot. The transmission growled when he shifted, the gear teeth grinding like bones. He winced. His instructor's voice from training echoed in memory. "Double clutch, son. Treat her right, or she'll throw you into the ditch before you know what's what." Slowly, carefully, he pressed again. Clutch, shift, clutch. The truck answered with a smoother motion, the grinding easing. He nodded to himself, relief softening his shoulders. Davis leaned back, boots up on the dash, though Harris would tan his hide for it if he saw. "You'll get the hang. Just takes practice." Outside, the sky grew brighter, but the light was thin, filtered through mist. Rows of crates sat waiting, fuel cans stacked in pyramids, wooden boxes stamped with black letters, tires bound with rope. Soldiers lifted them into trucks with quiet grunts, their movements mechanical, the rhythm of endless repetition. James knew soon it would be his turn, his truck groaning under thousands of pounds of supplies. As he sat in the cab, he imagined the road ahead. long stretches of narrow lanes lined with hedges, bridges patched together by engineers, crossroads where danger lingered. He thought of the stories whispered in camp, trucks shelled at intersections, convoys stalled by wreckage, bridges collapsing under too much weight. The truck shifted beneath him as though restless, impatient to prove itself. He pressed the accelerator gently. The engine responded with a throaty growl. He could feel the vibration in his bones. It was more than noise. It was promise, warning, and companionship all at once. A whistle cut the air. Harris stood at the front of the line, clipboard in hand, his hat pulled low against the drizzle. "Form up," he shouted. "Check your spacing, check your loads, and for heaven's sake, keep your eyes on the road. These trucks don't stop unless I tell them to." Engines roared louder. The ground seemed to tremble. James eased the clutch again, careful this time, and the truck lurched forward with surprising grace. The cab rattled, the seat bounced beneath him, but the wheels rolled steady. Davis gave him a nod of approval. "You'll do," Davis said softly, almost as if speaking to both James and the truck. They crept forward in line, mud spraying from the wheels ahead. James kept his eyes on the truck in front, its canvas flapping in the breeze. The convoy stretched far beyond his sight, a snake of steel and men winding its way toward a future none of them could name. For the first time, James felt the full weight of his role. He wasn't infantry, charging into fire. He wasn't a pilot, soaring above clouds. He was a driver, seat hard beneath him, hands steady on the wheel. His task was simple: keep the truck moving, mile after mile, no matter what. And yet, in that simplicity lay the burden. If he faltered, if the convoy stalled, men at the front would go hungry, guns would go silent, tanks would stop. Their lives rested on his grip, his focus, his stubborn endurance. He inhaled deeply, the air thick with fuel and mist. The hidden wish stirred again, the longing for home, for a morning without mud or orders. But alongside it grew something else, a quiet resolve, small and unpolished, like a stone held in a pocket. He would drive. He would keep this truck alive. He would do his part, unseen, uncelebrated, but essential. The convoy rolled out of the motor pool, wheels splashing through puddles, engines humming in harmony. Beyond the hedges, the countryside waited, green and damp, scarred by the war that lay just over the horizon. James tightened his hands on the wheel. Truck number 4077 responded with a steady growl, ready for the miles ahead. Silent divides shaped bonds behind the wheel. The rain let up by afternoon, leaving beads of water on the truck hoods, like tiny glass buttons. A shy sun pressed through the clouds, and the motor pool took on that washed, almost silvery look that comes after a storm. Men moved more easily when the rain stopped. Voices rose a shade brighter. Somewhere a harmonica tried out a tune and then thought better of it, fading into the clink of tools and the soft throb of engines being tested. James walked the line with Davis, counting crates they'd be asked to carry, ammunition, rations, oil in dented drums, and found comfort in the counting. The numbers kept his mind from drifting to the beach they'd reach soon enough, the one everyone talked around but never straight at, as if saying the word invasion would pull it closer. He liked the counting better. 4 stacks of rations, 2 tiers of tire casings, 3 crates of medical kits. The truck liked it too, he thought, as though trucks were calmed by order the way people are calmed by prayer. Toward the far end of the field, a smaller tent stood off to the side, close to the hedgerow, as if set there by a thoughtful hand that didn't want to draw attention. That's where the mechanics were, most of them white, sleeves rolled, jaws set. They were good at what they did, quick with a spanner, precise with a feeler gauge. But their tense distance wasn't an accident. The drivers gathered elsewhere, mostly black like James and Davis, eating under a separate eave, sleeping in rows that ran a little apart. No sign announced any of this. No sergeant stood at the crossroads of canvas and told them where to sit, where to sleep. The divide traveled other roads. Expectations, habits, the soft friction of stairs held one beat too long. A soldier learns to read roads, even the ones without signs. James had known of lines, of course. He'd seen them back home around jobs and counters, bus seats and school doors. But the Army's way was tidy, well-oiled, like a gearbox that had learned to grind without shrieking. Polite words, neat lines, rules spoken once in a tone that turned choice into law. He felt the weight of it most in the small exchanges. A mechanic inspecting his truck would speak to Davis to say what James needed to fix. An officer would say, "You boys," in a way that felt like a rope tug. Caution disguised as courtesy. None of it set the sky on fire. None of it left bruises you could point to. Yet it rubbed the skin raw. That afternoon, Harris gave out assignments while a wind shook droplets from the hedges like someone sprinkling seeds. "Wilson, you and Davis stick to 4077. Patrol run at 0500 tomorrow. Load at 04. He tore the stub from his pad and glanced up. "Mind your spacing. The cat eyes are there to keep you from climbing into the man in front." He moved to the next name without pause. That was Harris's way. Efficient, sparing. He treated everyone as if the engine in their chest ran on the same fuel. James almost liked him for that. It felt like a kind of fairness, even if it ran parallel to more stubborn truths. They took a break by the fence line. The sun was making a reluctant show of it, touching the roofs, warming nothing but hope. Davis had 2 biscuits saved from breakfast. They split them without discussion. Across the yard, the mechanics wrestled with a stubborn differential. A corporal with red hair wiped his hands and nodded at James's truck. "We'll get to that squeal you mentioned," he called, "as soon as we finish this widowmaker." The words were friendly enough. Still, when the corporal's partner wandered over a few minutes later with a grease pencil, he marked 4077 with a soft X on the fender, small, quick, a promise in shorthand, and then walked past James as if the truck had answered for itself. Davis lifted an eyebrow. "Some folks talk to the paint, not the person." "Paint answers faster," James said, pretending a shrug. But the remark didn't shake loose the pebble under his heel. He felt it as he moved, the private sting of being seen and unseen at once, counted and discounted in the same breath. War sharpened feelings the way rain sharpened a smell. Whatever you carried got louder. Late in the day, a mail sack arrived, stamped and stained. Men hovered like children around a candy counter, pretending they weren't eager. Letters were read in doorways, heads bent, faces softening or hardening depending on the loop of a certain hand. James's letter from home was short. His mother's plain script, sturdy and careful. She wrote about the neighbors, the streetcar, a new pie recipe that failed because the sugar had caked. She tucked in a dry maple leaf pressed flat behind her words. He held it up to the light and could see the veins like a hand spread in blessing. The cookie line formed at dusk. Men laughing at nothing and everything, looking for any sweetness the world might yield. Near the mess tent, 2 drivers from a different company argued low, their voices tight at the seams. A third stepped between them and smoothed the air with a joke, some soft common sense, and the argument folded away, put back in a pocket like a lucky coin. James watched the quick repair work between men and thought about the repairs one never saw, those done in the heart, those that left no chalk mark on fender paint. At lights out, a few drivers lingered by the trucks, unwilling to surrender the last of the day. A private named Morgan, a church tenor back home, he said, hummed a hymn so quiet it sat like breath on the air. Davis hummed along, off-key but steady, and James felt a thread run through all of them. Not a rope, not a chain, but a thread. Light enough that you could pretend it wasn't there. Strong enough to hold when the road bucked and the sky turned mean. In the days that followed, the separations moved with them like old luggage. Company cooks rationed sugar differently at different tents. The line for the officers' canteen curved away from the line for everyone else. You could walk all morning and never bump into anyone you weren't already standing beside, unless a truck misfired, unless a bridge failed, unless the road did something roads always do, and humbled everyone at once. Trouble is democratic that way. One afternoon, the democratic kind came. A crane slipped while lifting a crate of shells, and a lash snapped free, the load swinging like a bell. Men scattered. James didn't think, he just moved, hands up, shoulder braced, Davis alongside him, the two of them making a human stop against an impossible weight. The thing didn't crush them, because a mechanic yelled at the crane man, and a sergeant shouted to cut the winch, and gravity relented by a hand's width. When the crate settled, there was nothing heroic to point at. No medals came from the office. But the corporal with the grease pencil stood there a long beat, looking at James and Davis like seeing them for the first time. He said nothing grand, only, "You all right?" "Still here," Davis answered, rubbing his forearm where the rope had burned a red smile. "Still here," James echoed. Later, the corporal walked up to 4077 and circled the grease X twice, darkening it, then signed his initials under it. When he caught James watching, he nodded once, as if they had both agreed to a small treaty. The truck got its squeal fixed that evening. The tent where the mechanics worked wasn't any closer the next day, and nobody swapped places in the mess line, but the squeal was gone. Sometimes the road shows change like a mile marker. Sometimes it whispers it through the steering wheel. On a different morning, fog pressed down so low the air tasted of tin. The convoy practiced night spacing in daylight, following those tiny cat eyes as if they were stars in a private sky. The lieutenant running the drill called the white drivers by last names and the black drivers by first. Not because he meant insult, perhaps, but because he had learned his forms in a world that sorted automatically. He wasn't a cruel man, from what James could tell. He gave clear orders, and he worried the map as if it were a child's coat he was trying to button before the cold set in. But habits are engines, too. They run on whatever fuel you pour in them. After the drill, as men broke for water, the lieutenant came by, 4077, with a clipboard. "Wilson, you're smooth on the clutch," he said, distracted eyes on his sheet. "Keep that spacing as trained." He moved on to the next truck. A small thing. A name said plain and proper, yet it landed like a weight in James's chest. Maybe fair wasn't a road. Maybe it was a series of footsteps, each one placed a little truer than the last. That night, a storm rolled across the hedgerows, a long grumble that put out lamps early. In the darkness, James listened to trucks ticking as they cooled, and to the soft chorus of men settling into cots. Someone coughed in the next tent. Someone whispered a prayer. He thought of partitions, canvas, habit, history. He thought of the day they would drive onto a beach where no line would protect them, where even the rain would choose no one. He could feel the divide inside him and the bridge being built over it at the same time. The bridge wasn't made of fairness exactly. It was made of a partner's hand steady on a map while you steered, of a mechanic signing his initials under an X, of a letter from home with a leaf pressed inside. In the morning, the mud would remember every boot that crossed it, but the sky would not. Sky learns to forget on purpose, so the living can go on. The men would wake, lace their damp boots, drink their bitter coffee, and set their shoulders under the day. The roads would wait with their own quiet opinions, some kind, some narrow, all necessary. James cleaned the inside of the windshield with a rag until the glass shone like a pond in shade. He took the rag to the dashboard, to the dials, to the little places where grit liked to nest. Davis arrived with a grin and a dented tin of hard candies he'd bartered off a fellow from another unit. They unwrapped two and let the sweetness sit on their tongues. In a world that could be stingy, sugar carried the weight of sacrament. "Ready?" Davis asked. "As I'll ever be." They climbed in, and for a quiet minute, neither spoke. The truck's engine caught with a reluctant cough, then settled into something closer to happiness. James tapped the gauge with a knuckle, the way the older drivers did, pretending the act carried magic. He had learned the truck's voice in the last week. It complained about some things and accepted others. It forgave most mistakes if you apologized with your hands instead of your mouth. On the far side of the yard, the corporal with the red hair tossed a wrench from palm to palm. He gave a short wave that wasn't quite a salute and then bent back to his work. Harris strode through puddles reading names off a page and never once looked up to check whether those names belonged to black hands or white. He was measuring time, not men. In his arithmetic, a truck made its mark by rolling when it had to, and a driver made his by keeping the truck a little luckier than yesterday. The divides remained. The earth does not heal in a day, but the work reached a hand across them all the same. And sometimes in the cab, when the road unrolled like a ribbon and the hedges gave way to fields, James forgot the lines altogether. There was only the weight in the wheel, the note of the engine, and the still, persistent vow that tied him to the task. Keep it moving, make it through, bring the load where it needs to go. A gull flew low, cutting a white arc across the gray. Davis pointed without lifting his hand from his knee, as if he were pointing out a star to a child at a window. "Look," he said, voice barely above idle. "I see," James answered. He watched the bird bank and vanish into the pale. Some things crossed all lines without asking permission. Birds, wind, and the sound of a good engine turning true. Beside the wheel, a friendship quietly grows. The rain had moved on, leaving only damp air that smelled faintly of earth and coal smoke. The camp stirred itself with the same rhythm as always. Coffee poured into tin cups, boots dragged through mud, the growl of engines coaxed awake. Yet to James, this day felt a little different, for it was the first time he noticed how natural it felt to fall into step beside Davis. Davis was not a large man, not loud either, but he carried a kind of steady presence. His grin came easily, though it rarely flashed. It was more like a slow warmth that made the edges of things less sharp. He had a habit of keeping a toothpick in the corner of his mouth, worrying it like a man half listening to a tune only he could hear. When he spoke, his voice had a low roll to it, touched by the forests of Oregon, where he had hauled timber before the war. They met first as names scribbled together on an assignment list. Wilson and Davis, truck 4077. At the time, James had thought nothing of it, but sharing a cab, a truck, a bunkhouse rhythm of eating and waiting and listening that turned names into something else. The army had placed them together by chance, but the road was making them brothers of necessity. That morning, as they prepared for another training run, Davis leaned against the fender of their truck, arms crossed, watching James wipe down the windshield. "You take care of this rig like it's your Sunday suit," he said. James shrugged, cloth moving in slow circles. "If the glass is clean, maybe I'll see the potholes before they swallow us whole." Davis chuckled. "Fair enough. Back home, my old man said a truck was like a mule. Feed it right, treat it steady, and it'll carry your burdens, forget its needs, and one day, it'll drop you in the ditch." James lowered the rag, curious. "You really drove logging trucks?" "2 summers," Davis said. "Narrow roads cut straight through forest, mud up to the axle, chains on the tires so thick they sang when you drove. I learned quick, respect the road, or it'll make you pay. Out here, I figure it's the same, only the trees shoot back." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that makes the day seem a little less long. Around them, trucks coughed to life. Harris barked his usual orders. The air was filled with the click of rifles being checked, boots slapping mud, the low hum of men preparing without wanting to admit what they were preparing for. When they climbed into the cab, Davis tossed James a small wrapped candy. "Found a guy willing to trade. Figured you could use something sweet." James unwrapped it slowly, savoring the smell before placing it on his tongue. Sugar bloomed, sharp and comforting all at once. For a brief second, he felt like a boy back home, buying penny candy from the corner store. He let the sweetness melt, eyes on the narrow lane ahead, and said, "Thanks." The convoy rolled out, wheels splashing through puddles, cat eyes glowing faintly in the mist. James focused on the road, double clutching carefully. Davis sat beside him, humming low, tapping his knee in rhythm with the engine's thrum. Their silence was companionable. The truck itself seemed to approve, running smoother than before, as though soothed by the balance of their presence. A few miles out, they passed a line of soldiers marching in the opposite direction. Helmets bobbed, rifles slung, boots leaving dark prints in the wet soil. The men glanced at the convoy with weary eyes. One lifted a hand in salute, and Davis raised his own in return. "Poor fellows," he murmured. "At least our road's got wheels under it." James nodded. He thought of the weight in the back. Fuel cans stacked tight, each one holding life for the tanks up ahead. He felt the responsibility like an extra passenger riding between them. Davis seemed to feel it too. Later, when they stopped for a brief check, Davis climbed down first, stretching his legs, rifle slung casual. He walked around the truck with the easy air of a man measuring the world. "She's holding steady," he said, patting the side. Then, more quietly, he added, "You're holding steady too. Didn't think I'd end up with a partner who knows what he's doing." James felt heat rise in his face. "Still learning." "We all are," Davis replied. His grin softened the words. "But learning together makes it easier." That night, back at camp, they shared their biscuits again, seated side by side on a crate near the trucks. Around them, the camp buzzed with low talk and the scrape of utensils on tin. Above, the stars showed through ragged clouds, silver points in the black. James pulled his mother's letter from his pocket, folded thin from being read so many times. He didn't open it, just held it there, thumb smoothing the creases. Davis noticed, but didn't ask. Instead, he offered a story about his little sister, how she used to steal his hat and run circles around the yard until he gave chase. His laughter at the memory was quiet, but full, like a river running slow. James listened, grateful. He realized then what Davis had become. Not just a fellow driver, not just a partner in duty, but a mirror. Someone who carried his own aches, his own family memories, his own stubborn will to keep going. And in that reflection, James felt lighter. The road ahead would be dangerous. They both knew it. But sitting there, shoulder to shoulder, the night humming with the sound of cooling engines, James felt the smallest measure of peace. Whatever came, he would not face it alone. Before dawn, engines whisper of miles ahead. The whistle came before the light, a shrill note, cutting through the thin veil of sleep, waking men who had barely drifted into dreams. James blinked into the dark, canvas above him, pale against the faint glow of a rising sky. The air in the tent smelled of damp wool, mud, and men too long without fresh laundry. Someone cursed softly, rolling from his cot. Someone else coughed, the sound deep and ragged. James pushed the blanket aside and swung his legs down. His boots landed in a shallow pool of rainwater that had crept through the floor during the night. Cold shot through his socks, and he bit back a groan. Outside, another whistle blew, followed by Harris's voice, steady as ever. Up and moving, drivers. Motor check in 15. The morning ritual began, not rushed, but inevitable. Men laced boots with stiff fingers, folded their blankets into rough bundles, and pulled on jackets that still smelled of yesterday's rain. James slipped his mother's letter into his breast pocket, a quiet anchor against the day's demands. Across the narrow aisle, Davis yawned and rubbed his face, hair sticking up in stubborn curls. "You ever notice," Davis mumbled, "how these whistles sound exactly the same as the ones that call cows back home? Makes me feel like we're livestock." James smiled faintly. "Guess that makes Harris the farmer." Davis snorted, pulling on his cap. "Figures." They stepped out together into the half-light. The camp was stirring. The shuffle of boots, the low murmur of voices, the smell of coffee so bitter it seemed to cut the air itself. Engines coughed to life one by one, reluctant at first, then warming into steady growls. It was a music of sorts, each note rough, together a hymn to endurance. Truck 4077 waited where they had left it, the paint still streaked from yesterday's rain. James placed a hand on the fender, as if greeting a partner. The metal was cool, damp under his palm. He lifted the hood and peered inside, eyes scanning for leaks, loose wires, or anything out of place. The engine, old already before it left the factory, looked back at him with stubborn silence. "Fan belts holding," he murmured. Davis leaned in, flashlight beam catching the dull gleam of oil. "Good enough. Let's see if she'll sing." James climbed into the cab and pressed the starter. The engine turned over with a cough, then caught, rumbling deep in its chest. The vibrations ran through the floorboards, up his legs, into his ribs. He sat there a moment, hand resting on the wheel, listening for anything wrong. A driver learned to trust his ears as much as his eyes. Any odd rhythm, any new rattle, could mean the difference between rolling forward and being stranded under fire. Around them, the motor pool came alive. Drivers checked tire pressure with quick kicks, tightened straps around crates, tested lights. Harris moved down the line like a conductor, calling out questions, tapping fenders, his clipboard a baton keeping time. When he reached their truck, he didn't pause long. 4077, you're on fuel again. 96 cans. Load's ready. Get her stacked. He scribbled something and moved on. James sighed, climbing back down. Fuel was the most dangerous cargo, volatile, heavy, a beacon if hit. But fuel was what the tanks drank, what kept the army moving. There was no convoy without it. He and Davis worked with a team of loaders, stacking the cans in tight rows, metal clanking, the smell of gasoline sharp and raw. Sweat rose quickly despite the morning chill. As they worked, Davis muttered under his breath, a rhythm to match the lifting. One can for the tanks, one for the jeeps, one for the birds that fly too low. James chuckled, adding his own line. And one for us if this truck ever goes up. Their laughter was brief, but it loosened the weight in their shoulders. By the time the sun broke fully, the convoy was nearly ready. Dozens of trucks lined up, engines humming, exhaust curling into the pale sky. Military police stood at the head of the column, flags ready to wave them out. The air was filled with the sound of idling engines, men shouting final words, boots thudding as drivers climbed into cabs. James and Davis settled into their seats. James adjusted the mirrors, though he knew he'd barely see a thing once they were rolling. Davis placed his rifle within reach, checked the map, and gave a short nod. "Another day," he said. "Another mile," James replied. The flag dropped, and the convoy lurched forward. Tires spun in mud, then caught. The trucks rolled one after another, a river of steel flowing out of camp. James kept his eyes on the truck ahead, its canvas top swaying gently. The world narrowed to the hum of the engine, the rattle of the cab, the faint glow of cat eyes that would later guide them through the dark. As the road stretched out, fields opened on either side, wet from rain, dotted with farmhouses scarred by war. Smoke rose in thin lines where villagers tried to rebuild, to cook, to carry on. Children stood at the roadside, some waving, some only staring. One boy held up an empty tin can, shaking it as the convoy passed. Davis reached into his pack, pulled out a biscuit, and tossed it through the open window. The boy caught it clumsily, eyes wide. "Not much," Davis murmured. "But maybe it helps." James nodded, the image lingering in his mind long after the boy was out of sight. War carved holes everywhere, not just in soldiers, but in families, in children, in the land itself. The trucks rolled on, heavy with fuel, heavier with what they carried unseen. Hours later, at a rest stop, James shut off the engine. The sudden silence rang in his ears. He sat back, stretching cramped hands, eyes heavy. Davis dozed beside him, head tilted against the window. For a moment, James let himself drift, listening to the soft tick of cooling metal, the distant murmur of men, the faint rustle of leaves in the hedges. In that fragile stillness, the hidden wish rose again, not for glory, not for medals, but for safety, to finish the road, to bring the load, to live long enough to see another dawn. It was a simple wish, quiet as the hum of an engine before daylight. Hedgerows hide both beauty and sudden fear. The sea fell behind them like a door softly closed, and the land opened in narrow lanes that looked, at first, like something from a picture postcard. Stone cottages, low fields quilted in greens, a church spire pricking the pale sky. Normandy wore its years plainly. Apple trees leaned over ditches. Cows turned calm faces toward the noise and blinked unoffended. If one could forget the reason for the convoy, this would have been a Sunday drive after rain, a place where bread rose on kitchen tables and a bicycle leaned against a gate waiting for afternoon. The road, however, remembered everything. James kept both hands firm upon the wheel, thumbs resting not quite over the spokes, like his instructor had said. Behind him, fuel cans clinked occasionally, quiet reminders that their cargo preferred not to be jarred or jolted, that a hard bump could turn a dull day bright in the worst possible way. Ahead, the truck in front rose and fell, as the lane dipped and climbed like a breathing thing. Hedgerows pressed close on either side, Tall earthen banks topped with thick tangles of hawthorn and roots, living walls that hid entire fields and, sometimes, entire moods. Strangest fences I ever saw, Davis said, tilting his cap back just a touch. Back home, a fence is polite. It lets you see who's coming. These keep their counsel, James replied. He downshifted and felt the truck's weight lean into the grade. The engine answered with a patient hum, as if clearing its throat. The convoy moved like a ribbon tucked into a seam, invisible from a few yards away. Birds called from within the hedges, well-mannered and private. The smell of damp earth and cut grass drifted through the cab's open triangle of window. James allowed himself the smallest exhale. If a road could be kind, this one was making a good effort. Tight, yes, and blind at the corners, but holding together after rain, and the bridges they crossed were stout little affairs of stone that had stood longer than any man in the line. Now and then, the lane widened enough for a glance sideways. In those glimpses lay peasant gardens and a child's red pail. A woman hanging linens like flags of surrender to the returning sun. A farmer raising one hand in the old way that wished travelers safe miles. When the convoy passed through a village, the truck slowed to spare the stonework and the nerves. Chickens scattered. An old man lifted the brim of his hat. A girl ran, braided hair bouncing, to the edge of the road with an apple offered like a treaty. Davis reached for a ration biscuit and rolled it toward her palm with a smile that asked forgiveness for everything the last years had done to her family's world. The road bent left around a humpbacked bridge and then pressed straight between two tall hedges that met overhead like hands. Shade cooled the cab, and James felt the day hush of its own accord. You learn to listen, he thought, not just to engines but to air, to how it lays itself across a lane. There is a respectful quiet, and there is a holding of breath quiet. This was the second kind. Cat eyes are useless at noon, Davis murmured, meaning the tiny red slits on the truck ahead that would guide them at night. Have to trust the old senses. Old senses like yours? James said, smiling. Older than I look, Davis answered, but his gaze stayed on the hedgerow openings where tractor paths cut away like side thoughts. He unfolded the day's map without fully opening it, the paper whispering in his hands. Crossroads in 3 miles, then a narrow stone bridge again. MP point says, keep right. The hedgerow country asked drivers to be patient. Corners came tight, ditches were deep, the banks themselves, thick, ancient, made backing up a kind of confession. James kept his spacing as if he were placing cards on a table, each one set just so. He breathed in rhythm with the engine, draw on the straight, release at the bend, and felt his shoulders loosen into the work. A sharp crack sounded somewhere ahead, wood or something like it under strain, and then a hollow thud, not near, but not comfortably far. The truck in front lifted its right wheels and settled again. No halt from the MPs, no arm waved, just the road clearing its throat. James let the truck ease, then took the next gear up the hill under the bridge of trees. Could be anything, Davis said gently, as if to the air. A farmhouse door, a crate down at the depot, or a shell looking for someone to talk to. Road's too narrow for big talkers, James answered, and the two of them let the quiet do its work, the way one lets a nervous horse find its footing. They crested a rise and found the world wider for a few breaths. Fields stepping down to a creek, sheep startled into a tidy cluster, the ribbon of another lane running quick to the left. A military policeman stood on a wooden box at the junction, arm out, white gloves bright as bone china. His whistle hopped in his mouth but made no sound. Even here, discipline kissed silence. He waved them through without pause, and the convoy flowed as if poured. On the far side, the lane tightened again. The hedgerows now held more thorn than leaf, and their roots made the road's skin ripple. James kept one eye on the ditch and one on the tailboard ahead. The truck swayed. The load clinked faintly. His hands, steady as a mason's, worked the wheel inch by inch. "You ever think," Davis said softly, "about how much these lanes have seen? Carts and kings, I guess, weddings and storms, and now us, bringing gas to cannons and hope to men who've run out of both." "Maybe the road doesn't judge," James replied. "Maybe it only remembers." They passed a small shrine set into the bank, stone virgin, a smear of blue paint, a few wilted flowers in a chipped cup. Someone had been here this morning, or last night, asking for what everyone asks for in every century: safe passage, a little mercy. James touched the steering wheel with his thumb as if it were a rosary bead. A village lay ahead, and with it the first real sign that memory and present had quarreled. The church's windows were gone. The roof of the bakery bowed as if a large, tired hand had pressed down and left it that way. But on the stoop, a woman still shook crumbs from a cloth, insisting that ordinary chores could stand beside ruins. The truck's shadow crossed her as James passed, and she nodded once without smiling, the way someone nods at weather. Beyond the village, a bridge waited, shorter than it looked at first glance, just wide enough for one truck at a time, with a stone parapet that had been patched in the night by men who worked without asking thanks. An MP sign said, simply, "Go slow." James set the truck's nose to the center and let the engine walk across. Water hurried under them, counting stones. Halfway, the cab filled with the smell of moss and wet iron. On the far side, the lane rose at once, steep, and he took second gear with a careful touch, feeling the load lean backward like a sleepy child on his shoulder. The wheels found their grip. The truck climbed. The moment passed into the rear view where it would be filed with all the other moments of almost. The day stretched long and dim, a coin rubbed thin by too many fingers. Sun wandered behind scraps of cloud. Fields turned and turned in an old rhythm that ignored flags and orders. Now and then, the convoy pulled into a lay-by to let a tractor pass or to cinch down straps that had grown slack. In those minutes, men breathed deeper. Someone always produced a tin of something: biscuits, peaches, tobacco, and the sharing moved sideways down the line like a friendly rumor. By late afternoon, the hedgerows seemed to grow taller, as if the land were drawing its shawl up against a wind. The road grayed. A few houses huddled where it bent left. A dog watched from a doorstep, tail quiet, eyes old with knowing. Past the bend, telephone poles leaned in conversation, wires drooping like lines of laundry after rain. It was here the road's manners changed. The first hint came as a taste: metal at the back of the tongue, a nothing that meant something. Then the faintest pressure, as if the air itself had inhaled and refused to let go. James felt the hair at his nape wake. He tapped the wheel once, not for the truck, but for his own wrists. Steady. The sound, when it came, was distant and thoughtful, a muffled thump from a field beyond the hedge. Another followed, closer, then a third that found a fence post and made it jump. The convoy did not stop. Doctrine made that decision for them. The MPs at the last crossroads had pointed them forward, and the map agreed. James let the truck breathe. The engine kept its note. He left half a truck's width between himself and the tailboard ahead, enough room to think, not enough to invite new thoughts. "Crossroads in half a mile," Davis said, eyes on the map. Sign says St. Lo 17 if we could see it. After the bend, a short run under trees, then open ground, James repeated, not complaining. An open stretch was honest. If the sky had opinions, it voiced them there. The hedgerows, for all their beauty, sometimes held more than birds. They reached the bend, the lane darkening under beech limbs that knitted overhead like old friends leaning close. Through the green shade came 3 quick cracks, rifle or wood, and then silence so clean it rang. No command, no shout, only the engine's low prayer and the creak of the load riding behind. James kept the truck centered and moved at the posted pace as if a white-gloved hand still waved him through. Somewhere, far on the left, a rooster remembered itself and crowed absurdly. The sound made Davis almost smile, and then the trees fell away and the world opened. A long meadow lay to the right, grass laid flat in strokes from wind or something worse. The lane ran straight. Far out, a barn stood like a sentence that had lost its verb. The air here felt thinner, like a page where the ink had been pressed too hard and bled through. If anything would happen, it would happen in a place like this. The trick, James had learned, was not to expect punishment or favor. The road didn't deal in either. It simply asked for competence and a bit of grace. The convoy crossed the meadow untroubled. On the far side, the hedgerows returned, close and companionable once more, and a small orchard rained white blossom into the ditch as if to excuse the last mile. A cart leaned against a gate there, wheels sunk to the hub in mud, and an old man sat on it with a pipe that wasn't lit, looking at nothing and everything. He raised 2 fingers from the bowl as they passed. James raised 2 from the wheel in answer. In that economy of gestures, an entire conversation took place. I see you. I see what must be done. Carry on. They reached the supply point in the hour when light goes sideways and makes even the homely things seem holy. Fuel pyramids, tarps, the scuffed faces of drivers chewing cold bread. The unloading went like a drill taken from a catechism. Check, lift, pass, stack, sign, next. James felt the relief in his shoulders the way a man feels water ease a thirst. The truck, lighter by degrees, sighed through its suspension. A corporal with tired eyes checked their manifest and said, "Back via Route C. Bridge on B is temperamental." He made a note, glanced once at the sky as if it were a clock, and wished them safe miles without wasting syllables. Dusk gathered. Cat eyes would matter soon. James ran a hand along the dash the way some men pat a horse's neck before turning for home. He could still taste the metal in the air from that open stretch. But already the hedgerows were working their old spell, cooling and hiding, and in their own secret way, looking after the road. Beauty and fear were neighbors in this country, but most days, beauty answered the door first. They rolled out under a sky rubbed thin, a single star testing the east. In the narrow lanes, headlights were hooded to slits. The convoy settled into its night shape, space measured by trust and inches, direction held by a red bead of light no larger than a fingernail. The hedgerows breathed. The engines prayed. A dog barked twice and then thought better of it. "Good miles," Davis said, almost to himself. "Earned miles," James answered, and let the clutch bring them gently to the next bend. In quiet pauses, words homeward remain unsent. The supply point settled into its evening rhythm. Men with tin cups in hand, mechanics crouched beneath trucks with lanterns swinging, voices lowered as though the dark itself demanded courtesy. James sat on the truck's step with his knees drawn up, a stub of pencil balanced across his palm, and a sheet of lined paper folded against his thigh. He had intended, since morning, to write his mother again. The first lines came easily. I am well. I am safe. I am thinking of you. They were always the same, worn smooth from repetition, like coins handled too often. He stared at the words until they blurred. What did it matter to write them again, when by the time the letter arrived, days or weeks from now, he would be on another road, another bridge, another risk? What did safe mean when the word was only ever true in the exact moment of writing? Davis appeared beside him carrying 2 mugs of coffee. The liquid was black as ink, steaming faintly in the cool night. Wrote anything good? He asked. James shook his head. Just the same promises. That's all she wants, I expect, Davis said, lowering himself onto the step. He sipped and made a face. Boiled shoe leather would taste better. For a while they sat in silence, the kind that settles easy when 2 men have been through the same ruts of the road. Around them, other drivers scratched letters, their faces bent over the page, lit by lantern glow. Some spoke the words as they wrote, half whispering names and prayers. A few tore up what they had started, tucking scraps into pockets to be carried until they disintegrated. I tried once, Davis said quietly, to write my sister about a convoy. Thought maybe she'd like to know what it feels like. I stopped after the first sentence. Why? James asked. Because it sounded like bragging and fear all mixed up. How do you tell someone about riding blind in the rain with nothing but cat eyes to follow? How do you put down the smell of gasoline that might kill you if a bullet finds it? He shook his head. Better to write about the weather. James folded his half-page and slid it back into his pocket. Maybe that's the point. We leave the rest unsaid. The night deepened. Somewhere a harmonica started up, slow notes drifting like moths around the lamps. The tune was unsteady, as if the player were unsure whether it was a hymn or a lullaby. Men lay back on their bedrolls, caps over their eyes, trusting the ground to be kinder than memory. James found his gaze lifting past the glow of campfires to the sky. Stars had come clear after days of cloud. They stretched across the black in patient silence, the same stars his mother could see if she leaned out the kitchen window at night. The thought eased something in him. Distance, after all, could be bridged in ways other than letters. A sergeant passed, reminding them of the timetable, wheels rolling again before dawn. No one groaned. They had grown used to the rhythm. Davis set his empty cup down, tipping it onto its side like a spent shell casing. Another short night, he said. James leaned his head back against the truck's door. Shortest nights hold the longest dreams. Davis smiled faintly at that, but didn't answer. His breathing slowed, and soon he drifted into the kind of half-sleep soldiers learn to manage, light enough to wake at a snap, heavy enough to steal a little rest. James stayed awake longer, pencil still in his hand, unsent words still folded against his chest. He thought of what he might have written if courage came in quieter forms, not just that he was safe, but that he was afraid sometimes, not just that he was thinking of home, but that he needed it fiercely. Instead, he closed his eyes. The unsent letter lay like an extra heartbeat against his pocket, carrying truth he could not send, but also could not discard. Perhaps that was enough. A painted red circle turns into a lifeline. They brought them together in a field that still held the scent of last week's rain. Drivers lined in loose ranks, trucks idling behind them like patient animals. A colonel climbed onto the hood of a jeep and stood as if the ground beneath all of them were already shifting east. He did not shout. He let the engines quiet themselves to a thoughtful growl, and then he spoke about time, distance, fuel, and hunger, the 4 stubborn winds that move an army. He told them what the brass had decided, and the roads had already guessed. The front was running faster than the pipelines, and tracks could feed it. Tanks were coughing on fumes. Infantry were chewing rations to silence their stomachs. Medical tents were asking for bandages the way churches ask for candles after a storm, so the army would build an artery where none yet existed, not of steel rails or buried pipes, but of trucks, tires, hands, and will. It would flow day and night. It would not pause to catch its breath. It would be called the Red Ball Express, he said, borrowing the old railroad word for the goods that must pass through first. Paint crews went to work before the speech ended. A red dot was brushed onto fenders and bumpers, no bigger than a child's palm, but bright as a vow. Signs marked with the same circle rose at forks and crossroads, a breadcrumb trail for men who might be too tired to remember where the map ended and instinct began. MPs changed their habits. Their whistles now sang a single tune for any truck that bore the mark. At certain hours, certain roads belonged only to the Red Ball. No cart, no staff car, no wandering goat crowding its margin would step ahead of this fast river. James stood with Davis beneath the Jeep's shadow and listened to the rules that would govern their days. Intervals measured in paces and heartbeats. No passing on the route. Speed capped not by engines but by prudence. No stopping save for fuel and quick repairs. At night, blackout and trust. It sounded simple the way a hymn sounds simple. You repeat the lines until they carry you across a mystery you cannot explain. Back at the truck, a mimeographed sheet lay waiting on the seat, its purple ink smudged at the corners. Keep them rolling printed at the bottom in letters as insistent as a drum. Davis tapped it with one finger and smiled without humor. Some orders don't need adjectives, he said. Some prayers don't either, James answered, and folded the sheet into the map case as if it were both. Loading was a choreography learned in an hour and refined over miles, cans lifted by twos, the smell of gasoline sharpening the mind, crates stacked in crosshatch to keep them honest, straps pulled snug with a grunt that came from somewhere below the ribs. Hands dark with fuel wiped themselves on rags dark with history. The truck settled low on its springs, like a strong horse bending to a harness. At precisely the time stamped on the colonel's watch, the MPs raised flags and then lowered them, and the first wave moved as one. Trucks found first gear with a clumsy tenderness, then second with less complaint, and the column lengthened into a narrow ribbon that slipped past hedgerows, across patched bridges, through villages that peered out from under soot and laundry in equal measure. The day run felt almost civilized. White gloves flashed at junctions. Signs with red circles winked from fence posts like small moons. The convoy learned its new body language. Leave 60 yards, not 60 hopes. Breathe when the man in front breathes. Keep your hands steady, even if your thoughts won't stand still. When they paused to refuel at the first point, the work was as quick and gentle as a good barber. Tanks filled, oil checked, a loose strap given a second chance, a bolt tightened that had been thinking rude thoughts. A cook shoved tin cups of coffee into hands and called it medicine. Men did not argue with the prescription, but the route was made for night. That truth revealed itself at dusk, when the fields dimmed to charcoal and the sky let down a handful of early stars. Hooded lamps threw their narrow lozenges on the road, not enough to entice, just enough to remind you where the ground ended and trouble began. And then the cat eyes, those two faint red slits on the truck ahead, came alive and turned into doctrine. See them both. You're too close. See one. You've gone too far. Watch them blur, and you've found the quiet distance where a man can breathe. Looks like foxfire, Davis said, adjusting the strap of his helmet as the first true dark gathered. Looks like home lights when you're late, James said, and then set his jaw so the truck would not think him careless. Blackout driving did strange things to the mind. The world shrank to the small mercy of those two red dashes and the sound of your own engine keeping time with someone else's. Smell stood in for sight. You caught the damp of a culvert before your tires did. You knew by the sudden sweetness in the air that a blossoming tree leaned over the lane, and you prayed that its branches were high enough for the canvas to pass under. Hearing worked harder too. An out-of-place clink from the load set your knuckles tingling. A footstep in the ditch made your breath stop and count quietly to 4. They drove inside that thimble of light for an hour, then 2. The convoy moved like a single creature with many ribs. Behind them, the road unspooled into memory. Ahead of them, a mile's worth of night kept being born, one truck length at a time. They did not talk much. A few words made more sense than many. Left bend, Davis would murmur, palm resting on the map as if blessing it. Shallow ditch, short bridge, grade in a quarter mile. He did not always add steady because the road said it for him. At a corner where the hedgerow leaned in like an old aunt to kiss both cheeks, the truck ahead slowed half a breath and then corrected. James felt the wheel tug and let his hands find the center before choosing a new line as gentle as moving a sleeping child from one shoulder to the other. The truck behind them did the same. One by one, the decisions folded down the column, a murmuration made of steel and fuel instead of wings. Midnight came as a deeper dark, the kind that made even the stars sound distant. An MP post materialized at a crossroads, a hut with one low lamp, a thermos, a man who lifted his whistle but did not use it. He signaled the red ball route to swing left, and the convoy obeyed without a squeal or a fuss. Jam jars with slits cut in their lids marked the lane's edge for 20 yards, then gave up and let the drivers make their own arithmetic between ditch and hedge. Fog, Davis said after a while, tilting his head like a man listening at a door. Where? Where it always is, on the road 10 minutes from now. He was right. It came first as a breath across the windshield, then as a veil that the lights could not stitch. Sound changed under fog. Even the engines felt shy. The cat eyes ahead faded to smudges, then returned, then went pale again like something alive but unsure. James eased the throttle back a hair and brought the interval out to something that felt like prudence rather than fear. No one would count the extra seconds against them at morning's ledger if they arrived with every can and every man intact. At the river, the fog knelt lower. A makeshift bridge waited, timber on steel, its sides laced with fresh sap like tears on a face too young for grief. An engineer stepped from the shadow with a hooded lantern and a hand sign that meant one at a time. He walked their bumper across, looking like a small saint in a wet robe, and when the plank floor complained, he tapped it twice with his boot as if to say, "You're heard, but carry on." On the far bank, the fog let go as abruptly as a curtain yanked open. The moon was somewhere behind cloud, lending the fields a pewter sheen. In that thin light, James could see something the dark had hidden, how many trucks there really were. A parallel convoy moved on a route a mile away, their hooded lamps making a dotted line that curved with the fields. Another set, fainter, crossed them at a diagonal far off, like stitches on a mended coat. The scale of it made his chest feel both fuller and lighter. "Looks like the highway is the whole country," Davis said, voice hardly bigger than a thought. "Looks like the country finally noticed its own heartbeat," James replied, and the engine under his feet agreed by keeping perfect time. They stopped at the second refuel point shortly after 2. The halt was practiced. Roll in, idle low, tanks open, hoses in, a wipe for the filler neck, a glance at the tires, a hand run along the straps. Coffee again, this time with the echo of chicory, which someone swore improved the taste. A cook slid a square of something that was either brownie or rumor onto their mess lids, and they ate it without needing the truth. The mechanics crouched under the rear axle with a lamp and shook their heads in unison at some imagined catastrophe they had just averted. James leaned against the fender and closed his eyes for the length of 2 deep breaths. He did not sleep. He simply put certain thoughts into the glove box and smiled at the small order that act produced. A hand touched his elbow. Davis. Swap? Swap. They traded places. James folding the map open, Davis folding his spine into the seat. The truck accepted the new hands without complaint, which James took as a kindness. Some machines are particular. This one, if treated with respect, carried only a short memory for sins. The road east of the river ran straight for a while, then bent into a series of S's that would have made a river jealous. The fog did not return, but a low ground mist kept the tires whispering. The convoy thinned and thickened with the terrain the way a breathing man's chest does at rest. A farmhouse lamp burned behind a curtained window as they passed, and for 3 seconds, James could see a family's evening turned midnight. A teapot, a chair, a woman with her hands folded, a boy in 2 big socks. He did not try to guess their story. He had enough miles of his own. Still, he lifted 2 fingers from the map, and the gesture felt proper, like a tip of the hat in a doorway where someone had laid grief to sleep. Near 4 in the morning, the road did its small trick. A culvert's mouth, half broken by spring flood, had left a rough seam at the lane's edge, and 1 truck ahead, farther up line than the cat eyes could announce, put a right wheel just a hair into the seam. There was no crunch, no crash, only that subtle shift in a vehicle's shadow that says, not yet, but maybe. The driver caught it. His brake light winked, then let go. Word of the seam traveled back the way a rumor does in a crowded room. Tone, not language. Each driver took a half foot of grace to the left and carried on. No one would tell the story later because there was no blood to decorate it. But if the red ball had an accounting, a careful clerk might have added 1 line that dawn. Avoided. Many small ruins. Davis drove until the horizon began to think about light. He gave the wheel up with the reluctance of a man returning a borrowed coat that fit too well. James took it with the gratitude of a man given 1 more good hour than he deserved. The last stretch to the forward dump was a lane so narrow the hedges exchanged gossip across it. Birds were waking. MP gloves flashed. Somewhere a rooster forgot that war changes schedules and asked the morning to begin right now. They rolled into the supply area as the night unbuttoned itself to reveal an indifferent gray. Trucks peeled off at assigned lots. Men walked like sleepwalkers and worked like surgeons. Fuel went where fuel belongs. Shells where shells insist on being. Food where hunger makes a space. An officer signed their manifest with a pencil ground down to a stub and said, without ceremony, "Good run." That was praise enough. In the ledger of such nights, good meant everyone home, nothing smoking that shouldn't be, weight delivered to the right hands. No marching band waited behind the tarps to play them in. No photographs were taken. The road has its own currency. A nod, a lighter truck, a partner's chin dipping once as if to say, "You kept faith." By habit, they checked the tires again. A stone had lodged between tread blocks. James pried it free with his pocket knife and let it fall into the dust. It made no sound worth remembering. A mechanic noticed and raised his chin. "Next leg in an hour," he said. "Sleep if you can. If you can't, pretend they climbed down." The engine ticked as it cooled, tiny sounds like rain on tin. James leaned a shoulder to the fender and let the truck's warmth pass into him. Davis stretched his back and looked toward the east where the light was collecting itself for the day's work. Neither man said much. Speech had done its duty all night. Silence could have this part. The red dot on the bumper shone dull in the dawn. A small thing and yet not small at all. It meant priority without swagger, urgency without panic, duty without trumpet. It meant that somewhere ahead, men waited, counting on nothing so much as the next truck, and then the next. The road itself became their unending companion. The convoy rolled eastward, and the summer road gave up its secrets in clouds of fine dust. It clung to everything: clothing, eyebrows, rifle stocks, even the inside of a man's mouth until his tongue felt like sandpaper. The trucks stirred it into storms, each wheel throwing a memory of the earth into the air. By noon, the sky itself seemed dimmed. The sun filtered through a yellow veil that made the world feel less real. James kept a bandana tucked at his neck, pulling it over his nose when the grit grew too much. It hardly helped. The particles found their way past every defense, working into the corners of eyes, into seams of boots, into the stitching of gloves. He imagined, half humorless, that when the war ended, the trucks would still be shaking French soil from their undercarriages, little offerings left behind on every road back home. The convoy maintained its rhythm, despite the conditions. 100 yards ahead, the truck's canvas swayed in the shimmering haze. Davis drove, one hand light on the wheel, the other holding the edge of his helmet as if it might be lifted away by the rushing wind. His lips were pressed tight, and every now and then he spat out the window to clear his mouth. "You'd think," he said finally, "with all this dust, there'd be less mud." James laughed hoarsely. "Give it 2 hours. The sky's already plotting against us indeed. Dark shapes of clouds lingered at the horizon, heavy with the promise of rain. It was the cruel trick of those roads. Dry, they blinded. Wet, they swallowed. The convoy slowed as they entered a village. The houses bore scars from artillery and fire, but the streets filled with faces as soon as the first truck rumbled through. Children waved rags that might once have been flags. Women lifted baskets in salute. Old men raised hands heavy with memory. A girl with a braid tossed a handful of wildflowers onto James's hood, and for a moment, the air smelled less of dust and more of something tender. Davis tilted his head toward the crowd. "Makes you forget how tired you are," he said. James nodded. "Or remember why it matters." Past the village, the road narrowed, again, hemmed by hedgerows and ditches. Dust grew thicker, coating the convoy until each truck looked ghostly, outlines fading into the haze. At the next refuel point, men climbed down, coughing, faces streaked, hair gray as if aged decades in a single day. Mechanics worked with rags soaked in precious water, wiping air filters, shaking grit from carburetors. Coffee tasted of dust, food chewed like clay, yet laughter rose here too. One driver held up his canteen, pouring a trickle over his head and declaring it a French bath. Another offered to trade his rationed biscuit for a bar of soap, knowing full well none would appear. The humor was dry as the air, but enough to keep spirits upright. As they rested, an officer moved through the camp, reminding them of the timetable. Patton's tanks are moving faster than expected, he said. Every hour counts. Dust or not, the road won't wait. Davis groaned softly, lying back against the truck's wheel. Even dust has orders. When they rolled out again, evening shadows stretched long across the fields. The dust now glowed amber in the sinking light, beautiful if one could forget its taste. Silence settled in the cab. The men were too weary for words, each turn of the wheel a small act of endurance. James thought of home, of summer roads in Ohio where dust had once risen behind bicycles and not behind war. He wondered if his mother could still recognize him under all the grime, or if the war was painting them into unrecognizable shades. By nightfall, the convoy reached another supply dump. Trucks turned in, engines sputtering, drivers blinking grit from tired eyes. The dust settled slowly around them, finally falling back to earth after a day spent choking the sky. James rubbed his hand across the hood and left a clean streak no wider than a finger. It looked like a scar, pale against the film of brown. "Tomorrow," Davis murmured. "It'll be mud instead." James nodded. The road had its seasons, all cruel, all fleeting. Dust today, mud tomorrow, snow perhaps waiting in months ahead. Still, the trucks would roll, each mile another breath in the great machine of war. A broken span halts the convoy under dripping skies. The day had started with the same routine. Trucks lined like cattle waiting for pasture, drivers rubbing grit from their eyes, engines warming with uneven coughs. By mid-afternoon, though, the weather shifted. Clouds closed over the sun and drew the light down into something pewter gray. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of damp earth. Then the first drops fell, darkening the dust into spots that spread like ink on old parchment. James felt the wheel slide under his palms as the surface softened. Each mile turned the road into something untrustworthy, ruts deepening, puddles forming in hollows. By evening, the convoy was crawling, each truck leaning and groaning as though the mud wanted to keep them for itself. Davis muttered, "We wanted less dust." Well, the road listened. When they came upon the river crossing, everyone knew at once something was wrong. The line of trucks slowed, brake lights glowing red in the mist. Men climbed down, boots sinking into mud that sucked at their soles. At the edge of the river, what had once been a stone bridge now sagged half into the current. The middle arch was gone, the waters foaming through the gap. Broken stones jutted up like the teeth of some drowned beast. An engineer captain stood there already, his coat plastered to his back, lantern raised high. "Span's gone," he said flatly to the convoy commander. "Took the supports with it. No crossing tonight." The drivers gathered, their red dot trucks lined like stranded barges on the bank. Rain tapped on helmets, slid down collars, pooled in cupped hands. Some men swore under their breath. Others only stared, shoulders heavy. The schedule was already tight, and now the entire lifeline knotted here. James leaned on his fender, watching the water churn. "Feels like the river's laughing at us," he said. Davis shook his head. "Not laughing. Just patient. It knows we'll have to find a way." The engineers wasted no time. Timber trucks pulled up, beams sliding down with heavy thuds. Men waded knee-deep, ropes straining in their hands. A frame began to rise, ghostly in the rain's veil. Planks, iron braces, hammer blows muffled by water's roar. Drivers helped where they could, holding lamps, fetching tools, carrying lengths of wood across slick ground. Every face glistened with rain and exhaustion. Hours stretched. Lanterns flickered in the storm, halos of yellow fighting the gray. The convoy huddled in small knots, some dozing upright against their wheels. others smoking damp cigarettes that barely lit. James tried writing a few lines in his notebook, but the paper sagged with moisture before he could finish. The words bled into nothing, like the road itself dissolving under the storm. At midnight, the engineers called a halt. The frame stood across the gap now, rough but promising. 4 more hours, the captain declared. Dawn if the river doesn't change its mind. So the drivers waited. The trucks became shelters, men curling up inside with blankets that offered little defense. James sat in the cab with Davis, rain drumming on the canvas roof, the smell of wet wool filling the small space. Strangest thing, James whispered. I don't feel impatient. Just, small Davis nodded, eyes half closed. Maybe that's what bridges remind us. We can't cross until the world allows it. Sometime near dawn, a knock rattled the cab door. We're moving. The engineers had finished, a makeshift timber span stretching like a scar across the river. Each truck would cross one at a time, slowly, prayers whispered with every creak of wood. When James's turn came, he gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles went pale. The planks groaned beneath the jimmy's weight. The waters roared just inches below. Davis leaned out the window, eyes on the far bank. Steady, he murmured, his voice as much to the bridge as to James. They reached the other side with a jolt, wheels finding firm ground again. The truck exhaled with a hiss of brakes. Behind them, another engine growled onto the span, the ritual repeating. By full daylight, the convoy was rolling once more, 4 hours late, tires streaked with mud, men hollow-eyed. But the bridge held, and the road continued. Fire flickers on the roadside where danger waits. The rain had ended by afternoon, but the roads still wore its memory. Dark ruts filled with murky water, slick mud hiding under a skin of drying earth. The convoy pressed forward carefully, engines humming in tired unison, the smell of wet canvas and gasoline drifting behind them. James and Davis shared a silence that was less exhaustion than watchfulness. Something in the air felt taut, as though the land itself were holding its breath. They were no longer close to the beaches now. The route carried them deeper into territory that had been German only days before, and the countryside bore the marks. Barns with roofs half collapsed, orchards littered with twisted iron, roadside shrines chipped by shrapnel. Occasionally, a burned-out half-track crouched in the ditch, its metal skeleton glinting in the weak sun like a warning. It was near twilight when the road narrowed into a stretch flanked by low woods. The cat eyes of the truck ahead flickered in and out of view through the trees. James felt the wheel tug slightly under his palms, the truck fighting the mud. Davis adjusted his helmet and muttered, "Feels wrong, this stretch. Too quiet." The words had barely left him when the world cracked open. A burst of gunfire split the evening, sharp, unnatural, tearing through the air. Bullets slapped the road in little spurts of dust and water. Men shouted. The convoy lurched to a halt, trucks skidding sideways as drivers instinctively braked. "Out!" Davis shouted. They both slid from the cab, boots plunging into muck, carbines in hand, though neither had trained for moments like this. Up ahead, the rattle of an MG-42 echoed from the tree line, its stuttering roar unmistakable. Tracers cut through the gathering dusk, orange threads weaving chaos. A truck cab 100 yards forward erupted in sparks, its windshield shattered, the driver ducking low. Somewhere down the line a horn blared, then died. James pressed his shoulder against the engine block, the metal warm against his back. He tried to steady his breath. All around, other drivers did the same, crouched behind their trucks. The convoy turned into a row of iron shields. The air smelled of cordite and wet leaves. The convoy commander moved quickly, crawling along the ditch, barking orders low but sharp. "Hold your ground." Flank patrols moving. His face was grim but calm, the look of a man who had expected this sooner or later. Time stretched, strangely. The gunfire came in bursts, then pauses, as if the enemy was probing, uncertain how many they faced. In those pauses, James could hear his own heartbeat and the soft patter of water dripping from branches above. Davis, crouched beside him, kept his carbine trained on the tree line, though his hands shook. "Never thought I'd be in a gunfight holding a steering wheel all day," he whispered. Minutes felt like hours. Then, suddenly, the sound shifted. American voices shouting, the crack of rifles from the flank. A grenade thumped, followed by a scream carried away by the woods. The MG-42 stuttered once more, desperate, then fell silent. What remained was only smoke, the ticking of engines cooling, and the heavy breathing of men realizing they were still alive. When the order to mount up came, it was almost unbelievable. "Move out! Move now!" MPs waved the line forward. Engines coughed back to life, gears ground, wheels spun in the mud. Slowly, the convoy began to crawl again, headlights hooded, trucks sliding past the place where fire still smoldered among the trees. James risked a glance. The ground was torn, a blackened nest of branches and mud. A German helmet lay tilted in the ditch, catching the glow of the flames. He looked away quickly, hands tightening on the wheel. Davis exhaled long and low beside him. "Poor devils," he murmured. "War's over for them. Just didn't know when to quit." The convoy pushed on into deeper night. Conversation was sparse. Men stared ahead, each truck following the faint glow of cat eyes, as if the whole line had agreed silently to outrun the memory of gunfire. The rain had left mist rising from the ditches, curling like smoke in the beams of the blackout lights. Every shadow seemed alive, every bend in the road a question. But slowly, the rhythm returned. Tires hummed, engines purred, the line stretched steady and sure. The trucks carried on as if nothing had happened, because they had to. Patton's tanks would not pause for fear, nor would hunger, nor would war itself. By midnight, they reached the next dump. Supplies were unloaded swiftly, with little talk. Men moved with the mechanical grace of exhaustion. Each crate stacked a small offering to the idea that tomorrow might be easier. The fire by the roadside was already part of yesterday, though the echo of it lingered in every man's chest. James and Davis leaned against their truck when it was done, sharing a cigarette neither truly wanted. The smoke mingled with the damp night air, another layer of haze over tired faces. "We keep rolling," James said softly. Davis nodded. "We always do." Some loads carried more than weight. They carried lives. The convoy was roused before dawn, the sky still a heavy indigo, lanterns bobbing like fireflies as men tightened straps and checked engines. There was no singing this morning, no joking. Word had spread down the line during the night. Today's run wasn't fuel or rations. Today, they would be carrying the wounded. James stood by the tailgate as stretchers were lifted carefully into the bed of the Jimmy. He could hear the clink of metal frames, the muffled groans of men whose bandages glistened even in the half-light. Medics moved with brisk tenderness, their coats stained with work too constant to keep clean. "Easy now," one murmured, steadying a soldier whose eyes fluttered open, then closed again as morphine pulled him back into a fitful sleep. Davis watched quietly from the cab, helmet tucked under his arm. He looked different, as though the usual easy grin had been folded away for later. "Different kind of cargo," he said when James climbed back into the seat. James nodded. The truck smelled of iodine and wet cloth now, not gasoline. Behind them, 6 stretchers rested, each carrying a life balanced between pain and hope. The weight was not measured in pounds, but in heartbeats. When the convoy rolled out, there was no engine roar, no banter across the line. The trucks moved like a procession, each driver conscious of the fragile bodies in back. The road was the same, rutted, muddy, scarred, but every bump felt magnified. James gripped the wheel, easing over potholes as though the truck were made of glass. From the bed came small sounds, a cough, a moan, the shifting of boots against metal. Davis twisted once to glance through the canvas flap. "They're hanging on," he whispered. At mid-morning they passed a field hospital, its tents pale against the trees, red crosses painted broad and bright. More stretchers waited at the entrance, men laid out in neat rows, some covered against the chill. The convoy didn't stop. They had orders to push to the coast where ships waited, but the sight lingered. James thought of the endless loop. Men carried forward to fight, then carried back, broken, to wait for care. Trucks like his made both journeys. By noon, rain began again, a steady drizzle that slicked the windshield and blurred the cat eyes ahead. The wipers squeaked in their tired rhythm. James hunched forward, careful, steady. Every skid of the tires sent a jolt of fear through him, not for himself, but for the men he carried. At a checkpoint, MPS waved them through quickly, saluting as the convoy passed. One officer removed his helmet and placed it over his heart. James felt a swell in his chest. Not pride exactly, but something quieter, humbler. These were not just supplies to be tallied. These were sons, brothers, friends, each truck carrying whole families' futures. Davis broke the silence after miles of careful driving. "Back home, I used to haul logs that could crush you flat if the chains broke. Thought that was the heaviest load I'd ever carry." He shook his head. "Turns out I was wrong." The road narrowed near evening, winding through hills. Mud threatened again, and once a truck ahead slid sideways, men leaping down to steady it. James slowed, every muscle taut, until they cleared the slope. Behind him, one of the wounded cried out, then fell silent. James bit his lip until the taste of iron filled his mouth. At last the coast appeared, gray water stretching beneath an equally gray sky. Ships lined the harbor, cranes swinging, stretchers carried aboard where surgeons and nurses waited. The convoy eased to a halt, engines sighing into stillness. Medics swarmed the trucks, lifting the wounded with practiced care. James climbed down and stood aside, watching each stretcher carried past. One soldier's eyes opened briefly, meeting his. They were clouded, fevered, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of the man's lips. James raised a hand in instinctive salute. Then the truck was empty. Only the smell remained, faint and lingering. Davis joined him, resting a hand on the fender. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we'll be back to gas and shells. But I'll remember this run." James nodded, unable to answer. The sea wind carried a chill, tugging at his damp sleeves. Somewhere a gull cried, harsh and lonely. He thought of his mother again, of her letters, of the unsaid words he still carried. And he thought of those men now aboard ships, their own journeys uncertain, but still possible because a convoy had kept rolling. The road ahead vanished into a pale, endless shroud. The convoy left the coastal depot before dawn, headlights hooded, engines coughing into the damp morning. What awaited them was not the clear horizon of open country, but a thick fog rolling in from the channel, swallowing fields and roads alike. It muffled sound, softened light, and turned every truck into a phantom trailing another ghost. James gripped the wheel, leaning forward as though closer eyes might pierce the white wall. He could just see the faint glow of the cat eyes from the truck ahead, two pale smudges bobbing in and out of existence. Beyond them, nothing. Even the familiar sound of engines seemed dulled, wrapped in cotton. Davis sat with his hands braced on the dashboard, whispering, "Feels like we're driving into forever." The fog was no gentle veil. It pressed in heavy, clammy, seeping into collars and cuffs, dampening everything it touched. The canvas roof above dripped steadily, each drop pattering onto metal with unnerving regularity. Visibility shrank to yards. A bend in the road appeared only when the front bumper was nearly upon it. The men had practiced blackout driving, but this was worse. Darkness offered at least a shape of stars, a curve of road suggested by shadow. Fog gave no such mercy. It erased the world. One wrong turn and a truck could vanish into a ditch or worse, tumble into some unseen ravine. At a checkpoint, MPs emerged like specters, their armbands faint red through the mist. They signaled with flashlights hooded by their palms, guiding the convoy through a crossroads that might as well have been the gates of nowhere. James slowed to a crawl, gears grinding softly, until the figures melted back into the gray. Hours stretched. Conversation fell silent. Even breathing seemed loud. In the truck bed, cans of gasoline clinked faintly, their liquid weight shifting with every turn. James thought of how fragile it all felt. An army depending on trucks that could vanish if a driver sneezed at the wrong moment. By mid-morning, the fog thickened further, if such a thing was possible. Moisture beaded on eyelashes, smeared across the windshield, despite the wiper's squeak. Davis finally spoke. "It's like the world ended and no one told us." James nodded, though he kept his eyes on the glowing blur ahead. Or maybe it's waiting to begin again. Suddenly, the cat eyes vanished. James jerked the wheel, heart hammering. "Lost him," he muttered. Panic clawed at his throat. But then, a shadow loomed. A truck stalled sideways, its engine dead, its driver waving frantically. The convoy ground to a halt, horns muffled. Mechanics rushed forward, tools clinking. The fog made even small tasks monumental. Lanterns barely lit their own glow, shadows crawling like ink. Minutes turned to nearly an hour before the truck roared reluctantly to life again. Engines restarted up and down the line, each driver silently praying the rest of the journey would hold steady. The convoy crawled on. James found his mind wandering in the monotony of pale. Shapes teased his vision, barns, trees, even people. But when he blinked, there was only mist. He gripped the wheel tighter, whispering to himself, "Stay awake, stay with the road." Davis dozed briefly, his head against the window, until a jolt of the wheels woke him with a start. Neither laughed. At last, as the day waned, the fog began to lift. First a patch of blue overhead, then the dim outline of hedgerows, then the sudden burst of sunlight as the shroud broke apart. The world returned in color and depth, the green of fields, the brown of ruts, the glint of metal on the convoy's endless line. The drivers exhaled almost in unison. Some even cheered softly, relief mingled with awe. James blinked against the brightness, the wheel suddenly light in his hands. Davis stretched and said, "Feels like being reborn." At the next depot, as supplies were unloaded, men spoke in hushed tones about the fog. None described it the same way. Some called it a wall, others a sea. One man swore it had been alive. But all agreed it had been the most treacherous stretch yet. Not for bullets or bombs, but for the way it stripped away the world until only the road and their nerve remained. James sat on the bumper, letting the sun warm his damp sleeves. He thought of the silence inside that fog, how it had forced him to listen to his own heartbeat. In that emptiness, he had felt both small and necessary, a ghost steering another ghost, carrying lifeblood through a world that could vanish at any moment. The map promised a road, but the war had other plans. The morning began quietly enough. The convoy had slept in a farmer's field, the ground still damp from the night dew, the air filled with the faint smell of hay and the steady clatter of men preparing trucks. James sat on the step of his cab, sipping coffee that tasted faintly of rust and smoke, watching the mist rise from the furrows. Davis was tightening straps on the load, humming low, almost tuneless, as though the hum itself kept him steady. The orders seemed clear. Follow Route D14 east until it met the main supply corridor, then north toward the front. But maps drawn in offices never matched roads scarred by war. The convoy commander walked down the line, his clipboard tucked under one arm, voice rough with sleep. "Expect delays," he warned. "Road reports are thin. Bridges may be down. Keep tight, keep steady." By mid-morning, they found the first obstacle. A crossroads that should have carried them straight east was blocked by rubble. A farmhouse collapsed across the road, its stones tumbled, its beams blackened by fire. Cows grazed nearby as if nothing had changed, bells clanking softly in the strange quiet. The MPs waved them to halt, radios crackling, men spreading map across hoods of jeeps. James leaned against the wheel, watching the smoke still curl from the ruins. "Feels like the road's reminding us who's in charge," he murmured. Davis grunted agreement. "Roads don't care what the map says." Within minutes, the decision was made. They'd detour south, take a smaller road around the village, and reconnect with the main line 5 miles on. It sounded simple enough. But the smaller road was no true road at all, just a pair of tracks between fields, never meant for dozens of heavy trucks. The convoy turned cautiously, each vehicle groaning as it left the hard surface for softer ground. Dust rose first, then gave way to mud where rain still lingered. Hedges brushed the sides of the trucks, leaves scattering into open cabs. Chickens scattered from yards, children gaped from doorways, women pulled laundry from lines as the rumble of engines shook the ground. The road narrowed further, twisting between stands of trees. At one point, James had to edge the Jimmy so close to the ditch that he felt the ground crumble under the weight. Davis leaned out, eyes sharp. "Easy. Another inch and we're farming the bottom." James swallowed, breath tight, until the truck lurched back onto firmer ground. Behind them, another vehicle bogged down, its wheels spinning mud like fountains. Men leapt out with planks and ropes, shoulders straining until the truck heaved forward again, engines roaring in relief. By afternoon, progress slowed to a crawl. The detour stretched time thin, every mile feeling like 5. Supplies rattled in their crates. Drivers muttered curses swallowed by the hum of engines. But then, a bend in the road opened to a sight that silenced them all. Ahead lay a small stone bridge spanning a narrow stream. It looked ancient, the stones worn smooth, the arch sagging like the back of an old mule. An engineer riding with the convoy dismounted, crouched, ran his hands along the stones. He rose slowly, face grave. "One at a time," he said. "Any more, and she won't hold." So the convoy waited. Each truck inched forward alone, creaking across, timbers groaning, water chuckling darkly below. James's turn came near dusk. He eased the truck forward, heart hammering with each pop of stone. The wheels slipped once. The arch sagged visibly, but they made it, lurching onto the far bank where Davis exhaled with a laugh that was more relief than humor. The last truck to cross barely made it. Stones shifted, a small section collapsing into the stream with a splash that echoed like a warning bell. The bridge was gone, and with it, the road behind them. Their detour was now their only path. Night fell as they wound back toward the main supply line. The stars emerged above the black silhouettes of trees, the air cool and still. In the cab, James's hands still trembled on the wheel. Davis leaned back, humming again, soft and low. "Funny thing," he said. "We follow orders, but really it's the roads that decide where we go." James nodded, eyes on the faint red glow of cat eyes ahead. The map had lied, the bridge had crumbled, but still the convoy moved, its cargo of shells and rations rattling steadily eastward. The unexpected detour had cost them time, but the wheels kept turning, the road, whichever road, pulling them onward. The first frost turned every mile into a warning. The change crept in quietly, almost politely at first. By late October, the Norman fields that once glowed green were dulled to brown, hedgerows stripped of leaves, sky drawn low and gray. The trucks wore coats of dried mud, their paint faded, their canvas tops stiff with cold. Drivers woke to breath misting in the air, blankets stiff with frost where dew had frozen overnight. James rubbed his hands together inside the cab, feeling the wheel chill his palms. "Guess summer's gone," he muttered. Davis blew into his cupped hands and nodded. "Won't be long before we're skating on these roads." The convoy rolled out, wheels crunching through patches of frost. Engines groaned louder in the morning air, reluctant to turn over, and every backfire startled birds from bare trees. The Red Ball Express had already been a trial in rain and mud. Winter promised a new kind of battle. Ice, snow, machines refusing to start, and men stretched thinner than ever. At first, the frost was manageable. Tires slipped but caught again, and the sun, weak though it was, melted the sheen by midday. But as November deepened, the cold sank in. Water cans froze solid overnight. Oil thickened in crankcases. The simple act of starting an engine became an ordeal of curses and prayers. Drivers grew gaunt, their hands cracked and raw, their breath fogging the cabs. One morning, James woke to find his boots frozen stiff, their laces rigid like wire. He had to beat them against a stone to make them pliable enough to wear. Davis laughed at the sight, but his own breath shivered white in the half-light. "Welcome to the new front," he said. Fuel was precious not only for tanks now, but for warmth. Men huddled around engine blocks, palms spread to catch heat rising from the metal. Coffee turned lukewarm before a cup was half finished. Letters from home spoke of Thanksgiving turkeys, warm kitchens, fires and hearths, images that felt like postcards from another life. The roads hardened in strange ways. Mud, once their constant enemy, froze into ruts sharp as rails. Tires rattled in grooves like bones in a drum. Every mile shook teeth and jolted spines. Bridges grew slick with ice, their planks shining treacherously in pale sun. Convoys slowed to a crawl, not because of enemy fire now, but because of nature's silent ambush. One night, as snow began to fall for the first time, the convoy halted in an open field. The flakes drifted thick, soft, muffling even the idling engines. James stepped down from the cab and tilted his face upward, the cold kisses melting on his skin. Around him, men grew quiet, as if unwilling to break the spell. For a moment, war seemed far away, just a snowfall, peaceful, blanketing scarred ground. Then someone laughed, low and weary. "Snow'll hide the potholes," he said, "until you drop into one." The moment broke, and men returned to tightening straps, checking fuel, pulling blankets tighter. But James carried the memory of that hush, of how even winter's edge could feel almost gentle. As days shortened, darkness came quicker. Convoys drove more hours under blackout, the cold pressing in harder, the stars clearer above. Fires by the roadside became rarer. Smoke carried too far in crisp air, a beacon for enemy planes still prowling. Instead, warmth came from huddling 2 or 3 to a blanket, breath shared, silence broken only by the crack of joints, stiff with cold. Davis grew quieter in those weeks. He stared out windows longer, hummed less, spoke in short phrases. James didn't press him. The cold pressed them all. Each man seemed wrapped not only in wool, but in private thoughts, private aches. At one depot, they unloaded crates not of ammunition, but of winter coats, boots, and gloves, supplies as vital as shells now. Soldiers on the line needed them as much as bullets. James watched infantrymen receive their gear, pulling on thick coats, flexing new boots. Their relief was clear, their thanks unspoken but heavy in their eyes. Driving back west that night, James whispered to Davis, "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Bringing coats instead of shells, Davis nodded. Sometimes warmth fights a war better than fire. The Jimmy rumbled on, its breath visible in clouds from the exhaust, its wheels crunching the frozen earth. The Red Ball Express had faced rivers, fog, ambushes. Now it faced winter itself. But still the trucks rolled, steel against ice, men against fatigue, mile after mile. Every ending feels like another beginning on the road. The orders came in the half-light of a November dawn, when frost still clung to the canvas of tents, and men shuffled out with tin cups steaming in their hands. Word passed quietly at first, like a rumor. This convoy would be the final official run of the Red Ball Express. By the time James and Davis reached their Jimmy, the truth was settled. The Red Ball's days, all 80-some of them, had come to an end. It didn't look like an ending. Trucks still lined the muddy track, their olive paint dulled with weeks of grime, their engines coughing awake as mechanics banged wrenches against stubborn bolts. Men still moved with the same practiced rhythm, checking straps, tightening ropes, marking manifests. But the air was different, less hurried, more reflective, as though everyone knew they were rehearsing familiar motions one last time. James ran a hand along the truck's fender, feeling the scratches and dents, each one a story of roads survived. He thought of that first day in England, when the machine had gleamed new, smelling of fresh paint and oiled steel. Now it bore the marks of France itself, dust, scars, and the faint rattle in the steering column that no patch had ever quite fixed. "She's held on longer than she had a right to," he murmured. Davis climbed into the cab, his breath puffing in the cold. "One more run," he said simply. His tone wasn't tired, it was reverent, like a man reciting a promise. The convoy rolled out at 8. Their cargo was mixed, crates of medical supplies, pallets of rations, and, stacked carefully under canvas, winter clothing, thick coats, woolen socks, gloves. It wasn't the glamour of gasoline or the urgency of ammunition, but it mattered all the same. Winter had its own weapons, and the men on the line needed armor against the cold. The road stretched familiar and strange at once. They had traveled this corridor dozens of times, but today every hedge and bend seemed sharper, etched by the knowledge it might be their last glimpse from behind the wheel as Red Ball drivers. James noticed things he had overlooked before. A farmhouse rebuilt where one had once smoldered, children playing in a muddy lane, a church bell chiming faintly in the noon chill. Life, already creeping back, daring to grow in the wake of ruin. By afternoon, they reached a crossroads where an MP waved them through with a grin. "Last red ball, boys," he called. Davis honked the horn lightly, and a ripple of cheers followed them. Even the usually stone-faced military police seemed caught by the significance. This wasn't just another convoy. It was the closing of a chapter. As the miles ticked on, James found memories returning unbidden. The night fog that swallowed trucks whole, the ambush in the woods when bullets stitched the air, the bridge that cracked beneath their wheels, the day they carried stretchers instead of shells. Each memory clung like a shadow, reminding him of how much had been asked of ordinary drivers, young men pulled from gas stations and farms, suddenly tasked with fueling an army. Evening found the convoy climbing a ridge road, the sun bleeding low across bare fields. Ahead, the line of trucks glowed red in the fading light, each cat eye a tiny ember marking the path. Davis leaned back, his voice low. "Feels different tonight, doesn't it?" Like the roads letting us go, James nodded, though he couldn't quite put words to it. The hum of the engine, the vibration of the wheel, even the creak of the suspension felt weighted with finality. He realized he would miss it. The endless road, the strange companionship of wheels turning through night and weather. For all the hardship, it had given him a place, a purpose. They reached the depot near midnight. Supplies were unloaded swiftly, as they always were, but tonight the bustle carried a note of ceremony. Officers shook hands with drivers, mechanics clapped shoulders, and for once, no one barked at them to hurry back onto the road. Instead, there were murmured thanks, and a few cups of steaming coffee passed around, as though to warm more than hands. James and Davis sat on their bumper, sipping in silence. The night was cold, but the stars were brilliant, scattered across the black sky like frost on glass. James thought of home, Cleveland streets slick with snow, his mother's kitchen glowing with lamplight. He wondered if he would ever describe this to her, these nights when trucks became lifelines and ordinary men carried the weight of armies. Davis finally broke the quiet. "Strange, isn't it? We won't be heroes in the stories. Folks will talk about the battles, not the miles." James glanced at him, then back at the trucks lined like sleeping giants. "Maybe so," he said softly, "but wars are won on miles as much as on guns. And we drove them." When the wheels stopped, the echoes kept rolling on. The frost clung thick to the canvas when dawn came, brittle and white, making the tents look like they had been dipped in sugar. Men stirred slowly, their movements unhurried, as if they already knew the urgency had lifted. No whistles blared, no sergeants barked. The Red Ball Express had run its last convoy, and now what remained were men and trucks waiting for reassignment. James sat on the step of his Jimmy, mug of coffee warming his hands. The truck idled softly, its engine steady, its breath curling upward in steam. He knew another driver would take it soon, some younger face with crisp uniforms and wide eyes. But for this morning, it was still his. The wheel polished smooth by his palms, the seat worn to his shape. He reached out and patted the fender, the way one might pat the neck of an old horse. Davis appeared with his duffel slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, yes, but different too, like a man who had carried something heavy a long way, and now stood, lighter, for having set it down. "Truck'll miss you," he said with half a smile. James shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe she'll be glad to have someone new at the wheel." The camp was quieter than usual. Men moved slowly, packing gear, folding blankets. writing quick notes to families before transport trucks arrived. Some traded addresses, promising to write. Others simply clasped hands, knowing promises fade, but memories remain. It felt less like soldiers breaking camp and more like the closing of a traveling show. Props packed, stage darkened, audience gone home. When the orders came, they were almost gentle. Units would be reassigned, some to Antwerp, some to the Rail Corps, a few back to infantry. The Red Ball name would be shelved, its story written in figures and ledgers. 82 days, 12,000 tons daily at its peak, 400,000 tons in total. A miracle of wheels and willpower. James and Davis climbed into the back of a transport truck, joining a handful of other drivers. The wooden benches were hard, the canvas cover rattling in the breeze. As the truck lurched forward, James leaned to look back one last time. The rows of Jimmies stood waiting, their white stars faint under frost, their Red Ball insignia still bright. Engines quiet, but not forgotten. The road out wound past familiar sights, hedgerows now bare, villages where children waved, crossroads where MPs once held traffic open with firm hands. Life had already begun creeping back. Farmers worked fields, smoke rose from rebuilt chimneys, bells rang faintly from churches that had found their voices again. The land seemed to be taking a breath, as if relieved the rumble of convoys was easing at last. Davis pulled his coat tighter and spoke softly, almost to himself. "Feels strange, doesn't it? Like the road doesn't quite want to let us go." James nodded. He thought of the miles they had carried in silence and storm, through fog and ambush, over bridges that threatened to collapse, through nights so long they blurred into dreams. He thought of the men they had carried, their laughter, their curses, their silences, and the weight of supplies that had kept armies alive. The convoy was gone, but the rhythm remained, steady in his bones. He knew that when he returned home, when he walked Cleveland streets or lay in a quiet bed, some part of him would still be listening for cat eyes glowing ahead, still gripping the wheel, still rolling. The transport rattled on, heading toward new orders, new roads. Davis dozed, head tilted, breath steady. James leaned back and let the vibration of the wheels soothe him. The sky above was pale and soft, the kind of sky that promised snow by nightfall. He closed his eyes, not with weariness alone, but with a rare peace. The Red Ball Express had ended, but its legacy would stretch further than any map could show. Miles written not just in distance, but in courage, patience, and the quiet determination of men who kept the wheels turning. The road once belonged to convoys. Now it belongs to memory. It is a curious thing how the passage of time can turn hardship into story, and story into quiet reflection. Long ago, in those weeks of 1944, the trucks of the Red Ball Express ruled the roads of France. Their engines groaned in the fog, their tires chewed through mud, and their drivers carried not only supplies, but the weight of an entire army's hope. The world depended on them, though few noticed at the time. Now, the same roads are different. If you were to walk them today, you would not hear the thunder of engines or see long lines of olive-drab trucks with red circles painted bold on their bumpers. Instead, you might hear birds in the hedgerows or the slow rumble of a tractor plowing a field. The bridges once patched hastily by engineers have been rebuilt in stone and steel, their spans strong enough for modern freight lorries that glide more smoothly than any wartime truck ever dreamed. Think of the contrast. In 1944, a driver like young James from Cleveland might wake at 4 in the morning, boots stiff with mud, breath clouding in a canvas tent, his only warmth a cup of coffee as bitter as medicine. He would climb into the cab of a truck that needed coaxing to start, gear shifts double-clutched with care. The road before him was uncertain, marked by red signs that promised nothing except that danger lay somewhere ahead. And today, a young driver rises in a quiet house with central heating humming softly. His coffee brews itself at the push of a button. He starts his engine with a single turn of the key. No grinding gears, no worry of fan belts snapping in the dark. Satellite signals tell him the best route. Headlights beam strong and clear. Where once men prayed not to miss the faint glow of cat eyes in the mist, now GPS screens trace every bend before he reaches it. The rhythm of life itself has shifted. Wartime drivers lived by the heartbeat of necessity. Load, drive, unload, return. They measured days not in hours of rest, but in miles endured. Today, our pace is fast in another way. We chase deadlines, scroll through glowing screens, measure minutes instead of miles. We do not feel the earth beneath tires in the same intimate way, nor hear the groan of a machine that demands patience and care. There was a simplicity, even in hardship. In 1944, warmth came from huddling by an engine block, laughter from a fellow driver muttering through chattering teeth, comfort from a single letter folded and refolded in a pocket. Now comfort is easy. Thermostats, text messages, images sent in seconds. Yet easy things, for all their convenience, do not always settle the soul as deeply as hard-won ones once did. Pause and picture the old world again. The rattle of a convoy through a village, children chasing after with outstretched hands, women waving from doorways, a bottle of wine held up by a farmer who had seen armies come and go. The trucks were not just machines. They were signs of liberation, rolling proof that the world might be mended. Today, those villages hold supermarkets, paved parking lots, traffic signals. Children run with backpacks instead of empty hands. Farmers drive tractors with cabs that keep them warm. The echoes of convoys have faded into the murmur of everyday peace. What has been gained? Safety, speed, abundance. A life where food is not rationed, where gasoline is not measured by jerry can, where few of us wake wondering if supplies will reach us tomorrow. What has been lost? Perhaps a certain closeness to struggle, the way men once leaned on each other not because they wanted to, but because survival required it. James and his fellows never imagined the world we live in now, where goods travel in containers across oceans, tracked by invisible signals, unloaded by machines taller than houses. They would not recognize the smooth highways, lit brightly by rows of lamps, or the quiet silence of a car that whispers instead of roars. But they would recognize, I think, the same human longing to feel useful, to know that one's effort keeps another alive, to be part of something larger than oneself. So many of those old drivers returned home, slipping back into ordinary life. They worked in garages, drove buses, delivered milk, raised families. To neighbors, they seemed unremarkable. Men with grease under their nails, perhaps a limp from cold mornings in France. But in their bones lived the memory of nights when the world depended on whether their headlights caught the cat eyes ahead. Tonight, as we sit in our warm rooms, the hum of appliances steady, the glow of lamps gentle, it is worth remembering the strangeness of that contrast. Then, the world was balanced on convoys rolling through mud and fog. Now, it is balanced on networks we cannot see, ships we rarely notice, trucks that pass us on highways with little thought. We do not hear the urgency, but it is there all the same. The Red Ball Express is gone, yet its lesson lingers, that victory, survival, even peace are built not only on grand strategies or brave charges, but on quiet endurance, mile after mile, step after step. Then, as now, the lifeblood of the world flows through unseen lines, roads, rails, wires, signals. And so, in thinking of those long convoys, we also think of ourselves. Our roads may differ, our trucks may shine brighter, but we still carry one another in ways both ordinary and profound. The drivers of 1944 rolled through nights for men they had never met. We too keep the world turning for strangers, though the form has changed. As you rest now, perhaps let that thought be a comfort, that history shows us how much can be carried, how much can be endured, and how much is given by hands unseen. The road stretches from then to now, and though its surface has smoothed, its truth remains. The wheels that once roared now whisper in new ways. The world has always been carried forward on roads. In 1944, those roads were muddy tracks cut through hedgerows, rutted with frost, trembling under bridges patched with timber beams. The Red Ball Express thundered along them, carrying gasoline in rattling jerry cans, shells in wooden crates, bandages packed tight in canvas. Each mile was a gamble against rain, breakdown, or ambush. Now those same roads are smooth ribbons of asphalt, broad enough for 4 lanes, lit at night by tall lamps humming faintly in the wind. Trucks glide over them with suspensions that absorb the jolts, heaters that banish frost, radios that carry music instead of static. Cargo rides not in loose piles, but in sealed containers, tracked by computers, timed to the minute. Where once drivers leaned forward into darkness, searching for faint cat eyes, now satellites trace every turn with quiet precision. It is tempting to think that the past and present are separated by a gulf too wide to bridge. Yet, when you look closely, the link is plain. What the Red Ball began, an unbroken artery of supply, pulsing with lifeblood for those in need, is the same principle that guides our world today. The scale has changed, the urgency is hidden. But the truth is unchanged. The world runs on the steady motion of goods carried faithfully from hand to hand. In wartime, those hands belonged to 19-year-olds like James, clutching a wheel through rain, praying his truck would hold together one more night. Today, they belong to countless men and women who drive through dawn light to stock store shelves, to deliver medicines, to bring fuel where it is needed. Their faces are less often remembered, their stories less often told, but the work is the same, unseen, essential, carrying the weight of daily life. Imagine James stepping down from his Jimmy truck into the 21st century. He would marvel at the headlights bright as day, at the dashboard lit with glowing screens. He would shake his head at the ease of starting an engine with one quiet turn. Perhaps he would envy the comfort. Perhaps he would miss the raw connection with steel and mud. But he would recognize the heart of it, that someone, somewhere, still depends on what rides in the back. And imagine, too, what has changed beyond the road. In 1944, news came in letters delayed by weeks. Families waited at windows, counting days between words. Today, voices travel instantly, screens flicker with faces across oceans. Where once a young driver whispered his fears into a notebook by candlelight, now a message can be typed and sent in seconds. Loneliness has not vanished, but it has softened in different ways. There is a gentleness in noticing these contrasts. Then, scarcity shaped lives, ration books, careful meals, patched clothes. Now abundance surrounds us, sometimes so much that we forget to notice it. We step into warm rooms without thinking, pour clean water without pause, switch on lights without wonder. Yet those very ordinary comforts were the very things once fought for, once carried mile by mile in convoys rolling east. The Red Ball Express ended after 82 days, but its legacy was not measured only in tons of cargo delivered. It showed what could be done when necessity demanded, when ordinary people accepted extraordinary burdens. That spirit remains with us, though it may wear different clothes. It is in the quiet persistence of nurses on night shifts, in the steady labor of farmers before dawn, in the unseen paths of delivery vans that lace every city. And so, the road ahead is not entirely new. It is an echo of the road behind. We do not fear ambush on highways now, nor bridges collapsing under our wheels, but we still carry one another in ways we may never fully see. We still live by threads of connection, stretched from neighbor to neighbor, stranger to stranger, all of us dependent on lines of trust and labor. As you listen tonight, perhaps let the hum of your own world remind you of that. The heater's whisper, the refrigerator's low thrum, the faint rush of a car passing outside, these are the modern echoes of convoy engines, softer but still steady. They promise that life is moving forward, that somewhere someone is carrying what you need. Just as long ago a boy from Cleveland carried gasoline across dark French fields. Time changes the tools, but not the truth. Roads remain, wheels turn, and the lifeblood of the world still flows quietly through them. The Red Ball Express may be gone, but its memory is a lantern, showing us how ordinary hands and steadfast hearts can hold up the weight of history. And so, as you drift toward rest, think of the road ahead not as something sharp or hurried, but as something steady and kind. Long ago, men drove through fog to keep the world alive. Tonight, you rest in the peace they carried forward, the quiet rhythm of wheels still turning in memory.